Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. For this preamble, I'm going to start with a quote from page 208 of the book we're looking at today. Sri Lankan visionary Arthur C. Clarke said 30 ghosts stand behind everyone alive, a ratio by which the dead outnumber the living. You look around you and fear the great man's estimate might have been conservative. Every person you see has a spirit crouching behind them. Some have guardians hovering above and swatting the ghouls, the pretas, the rahu, and the demons. Some have distinguished members of these latter groups standing before them, hissing idle thoughts in their faces. A few have devils squatting on their shoulders and filling their ears with bile. Sir Arthur has spent 3 decades of his life on these haunted shores and is clearly a Sri Lankan. Now, Arthur C. Clarke wrote books about his scuba diving discoveries in Sri Lanka, but when he created a fictional scenario about human frailty and human evolution, he set that in outer space. The author who wrote today's novel works with similar themes, but he takes Arthur C. Clarke at his word and speculates about these unseen populations of influential spirits. The book we're going to look at today is The 7 Moons of Maali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka, published in 2022 by Profile Books in London. Let's pitch this book. No, let's let the author pitch the book because it's quite a simple pitch his. He describes it this way: dead guy trying to solve their murder in 7 days. Refreshingly simple. He says in interview that it was plot that he used as his starting point rather than any desire to examine great themes. And because the starting point is a murder mystery, that most popular of fictional genres, the book doesn't take itself too seriously. But it also follows that any novel that's going to talk about the afterlife, and especially one set in Sri Lanka during the atrocities of the 1980s, well, that book is going to ask and at least attempt to grapple with questions of living and dying and how one should go about either of those things. So you get the big themes as a bonus. Okay, so let's talk about the mundane details of this book, where I got it first of all. Well, this novel was the first book I ever pre-ordered from Amazon. In October 2022, a few weeks before I started my YouTube channel and just lurked for a few months, seeing what this BookTube thing was all about. Some creator must have sung the praises of this book, and so I went on Amazon and I pre-ordered for the paperback version when it came out. And then, the author's got to forgive me, but really the most powerful persuader that got me to read this book was the cover art. Because when the book turned up in April 2023, I'd completely forgotten about my pre-order. I had forgotten what the book was even about. And yet, the cover was irresistible. I would pick it up just to enjoy those trippy colors and that demon with his fangs and all the swirls around his head. The artwork was so enjoyable that I kept glancing at that book every time I was thinking, what shall I read next? It never let me forget the book that I had otherwise forgotten. Now, Amazon tells me I paid £7.19. That's about $8.95 US. The paperback is 408 pages long. And it's reasonable sized font and spacing. Now, also the other good thing, the author divides up his chapters into a lot of subheadings. And that may serve some literary purpose that I have not worked out yet. But I'm just saying they were very handy stopping places, particularly in the early chapters, which are longer. More about that later. But before we get to talking about the book itself, let's say a little bit about the author. If you go looking for a biography of Shehan Karunatilaka online, you'll find a sparse amount of information, but a lot of dry humor from the author himself. We know he was born in 1975 and grew up in southern Sri Lanka. He describes his childhood as being part of that Colombo bubble, which was a smaller group of the population that could live mainly unaffected by the violence that plagued the country during the 1980s. He attended university in New Zealand and he studied English literature against his family's wishes. He came slowly to a writing career. His personal website says this: he has over 20 years' experience working for ad agencies, tech firms, media houses, startups, and multinationals across Singapore, London, Colombo, Sydney, and Amsterdam. So a lot of time doing other things. His first novel manuscript, The Painter, was shortlisted for the Gratian Prize in 2000, but it never got published. In 2010, he self-published his second novel. Now, The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida was first published by Penguin India with a different title. It was called Chats with the Dead. International publishers felt that the mythology and the world building would just be too complicated for Western readers, and the British independent publisher Sort of Books agreed to assist Karunatilaka with some revisions that would make the book more accessible, and they settled on the present title. It was published in 2022, and as you know, it won the Booker Prize the same year. Shehan Karunatilaka currently lives in Singapore, and he's said to be working on a new novel. So we await a release date for that. About the setting. Well, it's important to establish this about the setting. You should expect to be completely disoriented and unable to make sense of where you are, because that will put you on equal footing with your protagonist, who is just as confused. He will function as your guide to the in-between, which is the first destination of the dead. But when I say guide, we're not talking Virgil. We are talking someone more like Dante himself. As the novel proceeds, you're going to find yourself becoming more and more familiar with the strange inhabitants and the natural laws that govern this state of being. If I have one complaint about the paperback book, it's this. Because there's no table of contents, and one tends to start a book at the beginning, or I do, I had no idea there was a map until I didn't need it anymore, because I'd got through to the last chapter, and lo, there was a map just as I was closing the back cover. Now, if the point of hiding the map is to ensure that readers can never quite get their bearings while they're reading, yeah, okay, I get that, but then it might as well not be there at all. If it's meant to be helpful, it needs to go at the front of the book, please. The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida is written with a second-person viewpoint. That is, the narrator addresses the protagonist as you. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this viewpoint, you've never heard it in a novel before, let me just read you the first paragraph of the book. You wake up with the answer to the question that everyone asks. The answer is yes, and the answer is just like here, but worse. That's all the insight you'll ever get. So you might as well go back to sleep. You were born without a heartbeat and kept alive in an incubator. And even as a fetus out of water, you knew what the Buddha sat under trees to discover. It is better not to be reborn. Better to never bother. Should have followed your gut and croaked in the box you were born in. But you didn't. There is a link in my description box where Karunatilaka answers questions from readers, and he remarked that regarding choice of viewpoint, he was influenced by a series of children's books that were published in India. And you know, he held these up to the camera, but there was so much glare, I couldn't see the title or make out the author's name. But these books wrote in the second person. However, I think there's another indication that the author put in the novel about the reason for using the second person, and I'm going to read this quote from page 384. When your body hit the tarmac, it made no sound, or at least none that could be heard over the din of the city and the hum at the end of the earth. You felt yourself split into the you and the I, and then into the many yous and the infinite I's that you have been before and will be again. Using the second-person viewpoint gives the reader the same ability to walk in the protagonist's shoes as if they were reading a first-person narrative, but with some detachment, because the I of Maali Almeida is a past existence, and it's an I that was, and it's therefore referred to as you, as someone else. It makes perfect sense in the context of this afterlife. Speaking of the afterlife, it's important to stress to us Western types that the world of the dead in this novel is a combination of, yes, some Sri Lankan mythology and folklore, but also bits from other mythologies and a really healthy contribution from Karunatilaka's own imagination, like the ear checks. If you've read the book, you know what I mean. That's a Karunatilaka thing. So please don't assume that anything is Sri Lankan tradition without doing some additional research. And a brief comment about dialogue in The Seven Moons. The author does not tag dialogue so that you know which person is speaking. Now, I get that. I mean, this is a world with spirits as well as living human beings very close together. But of course, humans can't hear what the spirits are saying. And anyway, do spirits even speak to each other in the way we understand speaking? So I get why dialogue tags might seem unsuitable, but I suspect readers will experience some moments of confusion, not sure who's talking, but maybe that goes along with the fact that the afterlife is confusing generally. I guess what I'm saying is that your choice about whether or not you decide to read this novel is going to depend on how much confusion you feel comfortable to just ride with. Does this novel fit a genre label? Since Karunatilaka is also a musician, yeah, he played in a band, I think he's going to appreciate it if I say The 7 Moons of Maali Almeida is a genre mashup. It's some murder mystery, it's also a ghost story, it's a mystic fantasy, but, it doesn't neglect to give the reader some sense of realism about society and culture in Sri Lanka, circa the period 1983 to 1989. I appreciated how the book was paced, because pacing is crucial in a mystery. Each of Maali's 7 moons gets a chapter to itself, but the later chapters get shorter and shorter as you speed up towards the answer to the question, who killed Maali Almeida and why? Now, the genre mix also keeps the book balanced between its darkness and its levity. It never let me take it too seriously or too lightly. The only warning I would give is bear in mind that it is a mixture. So if you come to this book with genre expectations that must be met, if you need it to be just like the last mystery novel you read, or just like the last ghost story, or you want that gritty realism all the way through, well, those readers are going to be confused or annoyed. The best way to approach this novel is to pretend that you, like Maali Almeida, have just died, and you need to give yourself time to adjust. What really stands out for me in this novel is its interconnectivity. Art remarking on other art. I love discovering these connections, and The 7 Moons of Maali Almeida was full of them. I'd love to give you a couple of examples, and they both concern a character which is a dead leopard, believe it or not, but that provided my best aha moments when I realized that Karunatilaka was referencing another work. I'm reading this passage from page 326. It takes place after an exhibition of Maali's photographs which prove government and military participation in the 1983 violence against Tamils. Outside the Lionel Wendt Gallery is a nameless tree with peeling branches, and on it sits a dead leopard. You know it is dead because you can see through it, and because its eyes are white. It looks straight at you and shakes its head. Its voice is elegant and gruff, though its lips don't seem to move. I was caught in a trap, laid by a conservationist to catch a poacher. The grief-stricken conservationist brought my body back to the Colombo University and then tried to kill himself. I was astonished. For the first time, I realized some humans actually have souls. The leopard in the tree immediately brought to mind Alice in Wonderland, of course, another fantastic work where the protagonists must get their bearings in a strange new world. Now, the dead leopard appears again toward the end of the novel, and he's asking one of the afterlife helpers if he can live his next life as a human, because humans can choose to be compassionate. And in that conversation, I suddenly remembered a connection with the third Coen Matrix film. I think it's Revolutions, which is yet another story, isn't it, about a protagonist who enters a strange new world and he has to work out what to do next. I remembered the scene on the Underground Railway where Neo encounters the machine family who want to become humans. And I've included a link to that clip from the movie in my description box. So in addition to this, you see, The 7 Moons of Maali Almeida, I bet, is full of pop music references, because Maali's got a great record collection, and you know that the author is a musician. And I don't know enough about all the songs that are mentioned to comment on any interconnectivity that might be there, but I encourage anybody who does consider themselves to have a good grounding in music. I think this book will be worth you looking at, definitely. Okay, now the usual question, is there problematic content in this book? There are descriptions of torture, of violent deaths, and the exact injuries that are inflicted on the victims. Descriptions of sex or erotic images are fleeting. They leave the reader to imagine most of what is seen. Expect frequent expressions of homophobia and characters who act on their fear of same-sex attraction. Now, the homophobia is driving the most important plot point. Without it, the story would need a completely different ending, and I'm not going to say more because that would be a spoiler. The violence is just the way things were. In fact, if anything, I imagine that what we read in the novel is keeping it light, right? It's a fraction of the true horror. It's just enough to make the point. Lastly, any suggestions for related or follow-up reading? Oddly, reading The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida made me ashamed that I've never read a translation of Dante Alighieri. But that only counts as related reading in the very loosest possible way. Closer to the subject is an interesting book that I discovered on a little Amazon browse, which I'm going to put up now. Tea Time with Terrorists, a motorcycle journey into the heart of Sri Lanka's civil war, written by the journalist Mark Stephen Meadows. Now, Mr. Meadows sounds like the kind of journalist that Maali Almeida would have worked for. Maali would have been the informed guide that would have gotten Mark closer to the Tamil Tigers. You needed somebody with you if you were going to get any closer to such dangerous people. I have no idea whether this is a well-written book or no, but I mention it because, how many motorcycle riding journalists could there have been during the Sri Lankan conflict? And that's another review done. Ha! Hey, can I just say a really big thank you to all the content creators out there who've tried their hand at my latest tag, In Your Wildest Dreams. I hoped that we would see a display of imagination, and I've not been disappointed. You've definitely delivered. I mean, we've had time travel, we've had bookshops with secret doors, we've had a plan to spend $1 million on just 100 rare books. I had no idea you could use up cash that fast on a few books. Wow. It's also interesting how many of you have seriously considered running a bookshop. I'm going to stick to reading myself. Please keep the ideas coming, and I will have more content coming out on Wednesday. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.